We're going to start off by looking at the differences between Sass and Sassy CSS. Remember that both Sass and SCSS, or Sassy CSS, are both versions of Sass. So I want to point out the differences, and really they work exactly the same way. There's just some syntactical differences that I want you to be aware of so that you're familiar with creating both types of files. What I'm starting off with is a very simple HTML page. So here I just have an HTML5 page. I'm linking to a style sheet that currently doesn't exist. If we look at my directory, the only thing in the directory is the HTML file. We will, though, through the use of Sass, be creating this CSS file. So this will be generated by the Sass file once the Sass file has been compiled. So we're going to go ahead and link to the CSS file that will ultimately exist. The rest of this page is just a very simple page. It has a header with an H1 and an article tag, all wrapped inside of a main tag. If we look at our page in the browser, it currently looks exactly like this. It's completely unstyled. I'm going to start off by working with Sassy CSS to begin with. So I'm going to make a new file, and I'm going to save my file. I'll save it in the exact same directory, and I'm just going to call it example01.scss. This is the extension for Sassy CSS. I'll go ahead and click Save, and now that I've saved it, I can begin working. We're going to go ahead and we're going to declare a variable. Don't worry too much about the ins and outs of working with variables. We'll talk about those in a later movie, but for right now, I'm going to create a variable, and I'm going to assign it some RGB values. So for our values, we'll be using 50 for red, 150 for green, and 150 for blue. And you'll notice that I'm going to go ahead and have the variable or property end with a colon, and then I'm going to have the value terminated by a semicolon. So that should already be somewhat familiar to you from just working with CSS. We're going to make a rule on the main tag, so I'm going to type main, and I'm going to open and close my curly braces, and we'll just go ahead and set a couple of declarations. I'm going to set my font family to the default sans serif font, and I'm going to set the width of main to 500 pixels. Notice that every declaration is terminated with a semicolon, and the property value pairs are separated by a colon. So this is the exact same type of syntax that you're already used to from working with basic CSS. I'll go ahead and I'll make a rule for my header H1 as well. And here we're going to go ahead and we're going to set the color. And the color, instead of writing out the actual color, we're going to make the color equal to our variable. So I'm going to go ahead and use base color. This is going to pull in the values from the base color variable that we've created above. I'll go ahead and save my Sassy CSS file. If I go into the browser and refresh, nothing has changed. And that's because I've created the SCSS file, but I haven't actually told anything to actually compile the file. In order to turn the SCSS file into regular old CSS, you're going to need to run the Sass file so that it will compile into a CSS file. Now there's a couple different ways that we can do that. You can do that using the command line. I'm not going to be covering that in this example. For this example, I'm going to be using the GUI interface, the one that I mentioned before, the program called Koala. So here I have the application Koala open. What I need to do is I need to tell Koala that it needs to start watching my folder that contains my Sass file. And then every time that Sass file is going to be saved, Koala is going to be able to compile and update any CSS files or create any CSS files. I'll go ahead and I'm going to drag my folder that I'm working on into my Koala pane. And so now I've set this up, and now you can see that any Sass or SCSS files are going to be added to my project. As soon as I've done that, Koala has gone ahead and it's compiled the file. So you can see that two new files exist. The map file is also called a source map file. It basically allows you to debug your Sass in any sort of dev tools like you would normally use with regular CSS. It's a great feature and can really help if you're having any sort of errors with your code. The other file that it's created is a CSS file. I'm going to open up the CSS file inside of brackets so we can take a quick look at it. And you can see that here's my CSS file. It looks just like a regular CSS file. Notice the color that's been generated. It's actually taken the variable that we created in our SCSS file and it's converted it into a hex value that's going to represent that color. So when we look at our project in a web browser, you can now see that the page is formatted with the settings that we have specified. The width is restricted to 500 pixels, the font family has been changed to sans serif, and our header is now styling with this teal color green. So when you write SCSS, it's really exactly the same as regular old CSS. Had I not used the variable, we would have actually set up a page that looked identical to the CSS file. All of the syntax and the way in which you code the page is exactly the same. Let me go ahead and show you what this is going to look like using Sass instead. I'm just going to go ahead and delete all of the files except for my HTML file. And inside of brackets, I'm going to create a new file. We'll save this file. I'm going to save it in my same directory, and I'm going to call it example01.sass. So this one is now going to have the Sass extension. In order to write the same type of page, we're going to start off by creating the variable once again. So I'll define the variable, and I'm going to set it to the RGBA values that we specified before, 50, 150, and 150. And this time, I'm just going to hit return. I'm not going to use a semicolon at the end of the statement like we did with our SCSS. Now I'll make a declaration for the main tag. I'm going to type main and I'm going to hit return. You can see when I hit return that the blinking insertion point is already indented. In order to use Sass, you're going to use indentation. So we're going to go ahead and write the same rule that we want the font family to be sans serif. I'm just going to hit return again. There's no use of a semicolon here, and I'll set the width value to 500 pixels. Then I'm going to hit return, and now I want to create another rule. So now I'm going to write my selector, which in this case is header 01. I'll hit return, and we're going to set the color to the value of base color. This part is identical to the SCSS. The only part that's different inside of our Sass file is we don't use the curly braces and we don't use the semicolons. It's also worth noting that there needs to be a space between the colon and the value that appear. Now that this is done, I'm going to go ahead and hit save. And when I do this, if we look inside our folder directory, you can now see that I have a CSS file that's been generated. If we go ahead and look at our browser and refresh the page, you can see that we get the exact same results. Now, because my page looked like this with the SCSS file, we don't see a difference. But if we come up here and we change our base color to something else, and I'm just going to save my page, and now we refresh, we should see that the header changes to a darker color teal. If we go ahead and open up the new CSS file that's been created for us, you're going to see that this looks exactly like regular old CSS. So our Sass file has been compiled into the CSS, and the semicolons and the curly braces are added automatically. So now that you know the difference between SCSS and Sass, you can make the choice as to which version of Sass you want to use. For this course, I will use Sass. I actually prefer Sass because you're ultimately typing less characters, and I find that the indentation method of writing makes more sense. I just think that it's cleaner and neater. I can reduce the number of lines of code ultimately that I'm writing when I'm using Sass as opposed to SCSS. But at the end of the day, whichever one you prefer using is just fine. If you're a beginner to Sass, it might be easier for you to work with SCSS since it's so similar to CSS. And really, you can just use a regular CSS file and save it as an SCSS file, and then you can start to use SCSS. The real power, though, is when you start using things like variables, mixins, extends, and things that are going to help streamline your workflow process.